Imagine, if you would, a world where there's no color. Everything's in black and white and shades of gray. Imagine a world where there's no weather. It's always the same temperature. There's no sun, no rain, no snow. A world where everything is flat. There are no mountains, no valleys, not even any hills, really. You go to school and you learn about science, you learn about agriculture, you learn about civics, but you don't learn any history. You have no idea what life was like before your parents' generation. You don't even know your grandparents. Your schedule is made by the government. They decide not only what time you start school and what time you end school, they decide how many hours you're going to spend volunteering, how much free time you have, when you go to bed. When you're old enough, 12, you'll be assigned a job. They'll decide what you're going to do for the rest of your life, how much training you need. When you're a little bit older, they'll choose your spouse. They'll decide who you're going to live with for the rest of your life. And if you and your spouse decide you want children, then they'll decide which children you raise. You don't get to raise your own children. That life that I've just outlined is a life without a lot of choices. And the question that this invites us to ask ourselves is, can life like that, without choices, can it be meaningful? I know a lot of you guys are at points in your lives where you're facing a lot of those life choices. You're facing the choice about, what am I going to do for a job? Am I going to go on to further training or not? What is that going to look like if I do? And those choices can be stressful. But what if you didn't have them? The world that I outlined is the fictional world of The Giver. Has anybody read the book or seen the movie? Can I see a show of hands? About half. That's pretty good. For those who haven't, don't worry. You'll be able to follow along. And The Giver is a young adult dystopian fiction world that completely ignores the existence of rights. It's a relatively simple world, and that's why we're going to use it as an example. But there are lots of other dystopian worlds, especially in novels. Many of them have been adapted to movies. You could expand the range to talk about video games and other art forms if you want. But all of those worlds give us an opportunity to look at something, some kind of value that is potentially missing. I'll talk about some of those other worlds at the end, but like I said, for now we're going to focus on The Giver because it's a nice, clear example and a lot of you already know it. And if you don't know it, it's not a terribly challenging read, so if you're interested, you can go check it out. But the key part here, to tie it into the theme of our conference, is rights are completely ignored. They're not respected at all, and the same is true to some extent in various dystopian worlds. Some there's more freedom than others, and it gets a little messy at times. So, rights, as Dan was telling us, are freedoms of action, freedoms to do things, to make decisions about how we spend our time, where we go, what we do with our property. In The Giver, we don't have those choices. There are actually no animals in the world of The Giver except for those that are needed for food. So there's no pets, no wildlife. There are no books or movies besides the rule books. You don't get to decide what you're going to watch on a Friday night. There's no music. You don't get to sing. We're going to have karaoke tonight. That's going to be a lot of fun. No karaoke in The Giver. There are no holidays except for just days off granted by the government. No Christmas, no birthdays, no Halloween. I know that's not celebrated everywhere. As I said before, no jobs, no choice of jobs or spouse, no ability to raise your own children, decide how many you have, no climate or geographic features. And what does this all come down to, really? When we look at this all together as a whole, it means that individuals don't get to decide who they are. They don't get to develop personalities. Because what is a personality? It has to do with all of the things that we choose that make us who we are. And when you don't have those choices, you can see, hope you can see anyway, in the photos, some of the rules in The Giver. Wear your assigned clothes. Obey the curfew. Clothes are a great form of self-expression, right? I was talking to several people earlier about, the dress that I'm wearing, the clothes that they're wearing, the shoes they picked out. They're a great form of self-expression. You don't even have that. because there are no protections or respect for individual rights. And another aspect of that is if we don't have selves, we don't have personalities, we can't form really deep bonds with other people, because those bonds depend on those personalities, on the way we view the world fundamentally. We can't even really have deep emotions, because emotions come from our values, things that we've chosen. Of course, there's little irritations, you fall, scrape your knee, whatever. There are small things. But the big things you can't fully experience without having a large measure of choice. Now, I think Dan touched on briefly, it takes force to violate rights. And in the world of The Giver, we don't see very much of that. In fact, in the book, there's no police force. In the movie, it only comes in briefly. So how do they enforce these rules? Well, there's the ceremony of release. Release to elsewhere is what it's called. And it's generally looked at as a positive thing. Somebody gets old, around 80, and they're released with a celebration of their life. If there's a twin, one gets sent to elsewhere. If there's a repeat offender, we're not able to rehabilitate them in our community, we release them to elsewhere. What we find out very dramatically is that release is a euphemism for lethal injection. So to keep their society on track, they are killing twins, underdeveloped children, repeat offenders, and the elderly. So that sounds pretty awful, right? Why would anyone do that? Why would you create that kind of a society where everything is literally gray and you have to kill people to keep things in line? Well, there are some apparent benefits. Some things that look like they might be worth it. Safety is a big one. There's almost no crime. How can there be when you kill people who break the rules 3 times? And everyone is taught from birth to follow the rules. There's just not a criminal culture. And along with that, there's low child mortality. Again, very few criminals. Also, the children are raised according to a very strict structure. Their nutrition is controlled for. Underdeveloped children are killed. So if you don't count that, very low child mortality. But what's the upshot of that for individuals? Parents don't have to go through the pain of losing a child, right? It's a very orderly and predictable society. You know what to expect. Things don't really change. They proceed exactly the same way. At the same age, each child gets certain kinds of clothing. They get their first bicycle. Everything is the same from one generation to the next, from one day to the next, from one year to the next. And all this is aimed at protecting people from themselves. Our main character, Jonas, in The Giver, he has this conversation at one point saying, well, it wouldn't really matter if you chose to wear one item of clothing or another. But what if people chose the wrong jobs? What if people chose the wrong spouses? We don't have drugs and alcohol in The Giver, but this is also a thing that sometimes people want to protect. People feel that we need to protect people from themselves because they could be addicted to drugs or to alcohol or something like that. So we need to protect people from themselves. We need to stop them from making the wrong choices. When people have choices, sometimes at least, they will make the wrong ones. The other side of this is the basic needs are all supplied. Everyone's food is taken care of. And in fact, they're very protective over this fact. Jonas, when he's a child, eager for snack time, I'm sure all of you have done this at some point, or most of you, you say, oh my God, I'm starving, right? I'm so hungry. And when he says it, and your parents maybe have rolled their eyes at you and been like, you are not starving, you're fine, right? Well, when Jonas said this, he's pulled off very seriously by his teachers and said, you are not starving. You have never been starving. You will never be starving. Nobody in the community is starving. Because they're very protective of these supposed benefits that come with their way of life. And there's no memory of pain. There's a sort of fantasy element to The Giver, which we haven't really touched on yet, which is when an individual dies, his or her memories are released into the community and they are accessible to everyone as though they were everyone's memories, until they made everything the same. Because you can't have people remembering that there used to be music and holidays and color and birthdays. So they keep all of those memories. All those memories are stored by one person, the receiver of memories. Jonas, when he's 12, is assigned to be the new receiver of memories. The old receiver becomes the giver, hence the title of the book. the giver or the receiver holds all the memories of pain. Nobody else has any memory of serious pain. Again, of course, injuries happen, small things happen. They're given pain medication almost immediately, and they never have to deal with any serious, lasting trauma. But such supposed benefits, to the extent that that's what they are, oh gosh, no, we were doing so well. There we go. Come with costs. They're not for free. When you routinely violate rights, when people don't have the freedom to choose how they act, as I've mentioned before, you don't get to experience the full depth of happiness. It limits or eliminates individual happiness. You may experience small moments of pleasure, little bits of what might come close to joy, but the full deep ecstasy that you can experience when you really achieve a value that you deeply care about, that's off the table. The long, sort of in-depth, long-term state of being happy that most of us strive for, that's off the table. Just in being who you are, being an individual, you can't really develop that. And as I said, love. Love either in a familial sense or in a romantic sense, it's not a thing. And as I mentioned a little bit with the concept of the giver, the receiver, whenever you're providing something for someone, and as Dan was getting at the end of his talk, somebody has to bear that burden. When we're talking about things like food, yes, everyone has enough food, but somebody has to produce that food. And in the world of the giver, if you quit your job, you are released. You're killed. If you can't quit your job without being killed, that is slavery, plain and simple. In the sort of spiritual or non-physical realm, in the giver we have the receiver of memories who has the terrible task of holding on to all the memories of war and famine and genocide and injury and death. He bears the spiritual burden for the community. So that's one of the other questions that the giver invites us to reflect on. That Jonas, the main character, goes through a process of change and discovery about. Is it fair to force some to bear burdens for others? And this is a question that you can see people debating out in the world in various contexts. People have this conversation. Some people will say yes. But as we're talking about rights and the role of government, that kind of thing, it's a question I invite you to keep in mind. Now, as I said, other dystopian works are out there. They invite us to reflect on other questions, other aspects of rights and how they affect our lives. We're going to talk about a few of them a little bit more in depth. First is Anthem, a novella by Ayn Rand, and it has some things that are very similar to The Giver. There's a very rigid schedule set by the government. They determine when you go to work, when you're off, what you do with your free time, et cetera, et cetera. There aren't actually any spouses. Procreation is something the government manages as well. You don't get to have any friends. It's a sin to prefer one person to another. You're supposed to treat everyone exactly the same. There are no books. There's no art of any kind, no music, no visual arts, except for plays, which all glorify the government and their and manual labor. Sounds like a lot of fun, right? There are again assigned jobs. They reject innovation in this society because it's too disruptive. So this society was one that was once thriving and similar to what we would think of as modern society, and it has fallen into disrepair, such that candles and windows are seen as recent developments. And when people try to introduce new innovations, they are thrown out. And perhaps the most striking element of Anthem is because people are supposed to live for the group, for the community, for the state, they are encouraged to think so much of themselves as part of a group that they don't even have the word I anymore. It's we and they the whole time. Another one you guys might be familiar with. Actually, has anybody read 1984? Show of hands. Oh, good. Okay, that's more than I was expecting. Fantastic. So George Orwell's classic of the genre, 1984. In this world, rights are so far off the table, we're not even thinking about them. There aren't even straight law, like regular laws people can follow. That things are not illegal except for thought crime. Crimes that go against the party, even if they're just in your mind. It's not enough to act like the party wants you to act or say the things the party wants you to say. You have to think the way the party wants you to think. And thought crime and other words like that have kind of slipped into the cultural vocabulary. You may recognize some of them even if you haven't read the book, because of how influential this book has been. In order to control people's minds to the extent that you actually can, the party controls everything that affects your mind. It controls the recording of history. The main character, Winston, his job is to correct history so that it matches, you can't correct history, but correcting the history books and texts and so on, so that it matches what the party is saying. They control the art. There's censorship and editing of older artworks so that it's in line with the party's messages. They control the news in the same way. In order to have a scapegoat, someone to blame for the problems, the party is constantly at war with one or another of the other major world powers, but who that is constantly shifting, and everyone is supposed to act like it's always been the way that it is now. If you're in the party, even if you're not like a super important member, and this calls back to like Soviet Russia or communist China, where lots of people joined the party because you couldn't get a job if you didn't. So you have a lot of, they're called outer party members, who still have to follow more intense rules. For example, their marriages need to be approved by the party. They're not for personal enjoyment or fulfillment. They're to provide new members for the party, new people for the party to rule. And the other feature of 1984 that a lot of people really find interesting, and that comes into conversation a lot today, is the constant surveillance. Not only are there two-way screens in every room that cannot be turned off, but there's also informants everywhere. And this was probably inspired by Nazi Germany, a little bit of East Germany, although Orwell didn't live to see much of that, where the ratio of informant to citizen was massive. So many people, even children, were encouraged to inform on their parents, on their neighbors, on their friends. And this gave rise to the line that you may have heard in some form, Big Brother is watching. I think nowadays you hear more often Big Brother is always watching. That's not actually in the original, but it doesn't change the meaning. And Big Brother, who is supposedly the leader of the party, but we're not actually sure if in the context of the novel he's real, the description we get matches that of Stalin. So Orwell was drawing on real-life tyrannies to present this world in which, theoretically, even what you think is controlled by the government. And finally, Fahrenheit 451. Has anyone read this one? Show of hands? A few, okay. This is also a fairly short one. But Fahrenheit 451, which is named after the temperature at which paper burns, is a world in which firefighters don't start fires, or don't put out fires, they start them. And specifically, their main job is to burn books. So in this world, it's not surprising that there's no art left. Nobody studies art. Nobody produces art, not just literature, but any kind of art. There are only the technical sciences. If you get an education at all, really, it's about how to engineer things, how to build things, how to work in a factory. There's political censorship to the point that there's really only one view that's expressed and nothing else is around at all. And the thing is, in this society, you can't really think about things. You can't really dig into ideas or stories. There's constantly noise. There's constantly radios, TVs, something to be a buzz. But that's not really satisfying, is it? So people go out looking for more. They go out seeking thrills. They go out driving cars at 200 miles an hour, skydiving, all those kinds of crazy things. And as a result, a lot of people get hurt, whether it's by accident or because people just don't care. They aren't able to form deep bonds because they don't have not just books, but the content of books. It doesn't matter what the format is, right? But the ideas, the stories, the knowledge that you gain from a book, again, could be in another format, that you can really sink your mind into. You can really think about, Hannah used the phrase a couple of times, grappling with ideas. That's what you can't do in the world of Fahrenheit 451. That's what you can't do without those kinds of materials. So there are a great many other dystopias where to some extent, to some extent, in some way, rights are either ignored, not understood, or actively violated systematically violated in many cases. Each author who looks at this genre has a new approach, has a different thing he or she wants to emphasize, has a different thought about what the result is for the individual, how to fight that kind of system if it's even possible, what made it happen, what were the cultural forces that led us to that point. And so although dystopian fiction can be a little bit bleak at times, I think there's a lot of value in a great many of the dystopian works that are out there because they invite you to think about those kinds of questions, because they show us the importance of rights in our lives and on a large scale. So this is just a selection, but this is a selection of dystopian fiction that I think is valuable for one reason or another, and I would love to talk with you guys about it at any point. So this is an invitation to ask me about any of these books. I would be delighted. And Abby, do we have time for questions? Okay, wonderful. So as I said, I love to talk about fiction and ideas. I have a Substack where that's all I do. So if you're also a person who enjoys digging into that kind of thing, please feel free to join me there. And Abby says I have 5 minutes, so I can take maybe 2 questions. Got hands over here?
Yep. I'll give you a mic. 1 second.
Okay.
In all the dystopian fiction books that you've read, what do you think is the worst thing that has been written about?
Like the worst topic?
Yeah.
Ooh. It's a really challenging question, but just off the top of my head, I'm going to go with in The Handmaid's Tale. They very actively destroy people's self-esteem. And in doing that, it destroys you so much on an individual level that you can't even conceive of not only of things being different, because many of people in that world still remember things being different, but you can't conceive of you deserving different. And self-esteem, I think, is so essential in so many ways. So I think The Handmaid's Tale is a really interesting look at the psychological effects of destroying self-esteem in order to enable tyranny. I think, Elisa?
When you mentioned the whole thing about in George Orwell's 1984, like the constant shifting of, oh no, that's the bad people now. That really mimics reality. It mirrors reality nearly perfectly in how certain people will scapegoat, like, these people are bad because, and then they'll do the same exact thing they did last time. Like how it went from, let's say like, black people used to be like, oh, they can't go to this bathroom because no, they're predators and they're gonna go after you. And then it shifted to queer people where it's like, you can't go after those people because they're gonna do the same thing. It's like the argument always changes to the person they hate at the moment. It perfectly mimics reality. How do you feel about that?
It's often said that dystopian novels are a warning. And it does sometimes feel like Orwell was very prescient in some ways, that he predicted a lot of things. But I think the novels that feel that way, and the nonfiction writing too that feels that way, it's because the author was getting at some deep fundamental truth, some principle that is true in all times and people will use over and over again. Having a scapegoat, someone to point to as the bad guy, whoever that is, gives you a reason to have more power, because you got to fight the bad guys. You got to protect people from the bad guys, right? So I definitely would say that scapegoating like that is a sort of red flag, and that Orwell knew perfectly well that that's what tyrannical regimes and individuals who are power lusters do. So yeah, I would say anytime something feels prescient, whether it's in fiction or nonfiction, it's probably because there's an important principle there that the author is getting at. Do we have time for one more?
Yes, we have
Okay,
one
we have a few
more.
questions over here.
Well, thanks. Well, I have read and also watched the movies of the Hunger Games, and I always thought that there has been like a new conception of what it really represents, because I think like as you say that it's about like oppression and a regime, but some people have seen it as maybe like a socialist revolution at the end. Like they have I mean, at least I heard so many people saying that that's what it means at the end, and I don't think that. But what would you say to someone that says, for example, that about the Hunger Games and all the history?
Interesting. I've not heard that take. I don't think that there's anything that's explicitly socialist in the Hunger Games. I think it's very democratic in terms of, at the end, the rebels who take over are supposed to be a very democratic system, and Katniss is concerned that they're not actually democratic enough, that the president who's been leading the rebels is herself a power luster. So there's sort of a warning there that the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend, as the old saying goes. But I think I don't see anything explicitly socialist. That's very odd to me that would be the case. It is, so not everyone knows, there's a prequel now out to the Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which really goes into like the psychology of President Snow, which is fascinating. But it sets up very well how what you could see as like the capitalist capital is actually not capitalist at all. And everything has been, and it's been that way for a long time, that people have been taking advantage of their power, using force to keep things the way they are for decades. So it's gotten to the point that it's gotten not because of capitalism, but because people have been using power to control others, and it's been that way for a long time. I don't see anything explicitly socialist. That's very interesting. I'd have to talk to somebody who holds that view to flesh it out a bit more, but thank you. All right, thank you guys so much.